US that climate change is not it's not a technological or scientific question. It's first and foremost a value question. And if we are to maintain our way of life, our economic growth, and first and foremost economic models, we can't do this century. And that's why something has to give. It has to happen, and unfortunately those big parties that want to keep this form of global system in place very often vote for nuclear power, because that's out of the big energy solutions essentially the only one that we can rely to convey enough energy for the current need. So I think there are many conversations around this, but this is first and foremost society change or transformation that needs to happen in the way we are doing business. And I think that's what our paper tries to say, including also new governance, indigenous governance, transformation of society, and in itself to say, look, climate change is not only numbers or how hot it will be, it's already underway as a regime shift in the species and birds and fish that's going on.
A couple of questions along the lines of what we've been talking about. Naomi Oreskes, in one of her latest books, has a really interesting viewpoint of the world 100 years from now, when the 1 billion or 1.5 billion displaced people have moved to northern Europe and northern Canada, and the world is a much different place. Governments have changed. Do you think that that's possible?
Who would believe the war in Syria or the end of the Cold War? Nobody. So we should be very careful when we try to say there's stability in the current system, especially if we have drivers such as the ones that we are trying to talk about in the paper and also have been recognized by IPCC and many others. So yes, I do think this will be a very different century than what we are seeing, and obviously it will be also a Pacific century in the sense that as long as global trade and economy will stay in place despite climate change, this will be the powerhouse of Singapore, China, and all India. Look at what Prime Minister Modi is doing in India and what's happening. So these are booming things, and I think all of this will radiate to the geopolitical system. Now, if we would see a climate collapse and loss of this current system of governance leading to a massive move of people or people on the move, yes, it's possible. We worked with an assessment called Climate Risk with Obama's administration in 2015, and you can find it on the Snow Change website under links. And one of the scenarios there points to this direction. Now, however, despite the doom and gloom, I would like to be speaking about today. We still have a lot of things to do, and like President Obama was saying, we are the first generation to feel the impact of climate change and the last one to do something meaningful about that. So I think the urgent burning presence of things that we should be doing now is the one we need to focus on, despite the doom and gloom rhetorics coming from many scenarios.
The study that you covered deals with resources, industries, conflict. You spend a lot of time talking about health. I'm wondering if you can share what you've learned from indigenous cultures.
Yeah, thank you. This is one of and we have to position this also in the current matrix of how societies understand change. Science Journal is one of the sort of keystone and key ways of trying to convey what's going on, and that's why the fact that we were able to recognize both indigenous knowledge and responses by the communities in the Arctic in that study tells a big story of the necessity of new kind of relations with the First Nations, for example, in British Columbia. One of the things we learned doing this study was that place names of the indigenous peoples in their local languages can convey profound information about how things are. To give you a BC example, the Haida up in Haida Kwai, while they were not part of this study, but from previous work with them, have oral histories that indicate memories relating to the Ice Age. and even beyond. So place names and the kind of attachment to the land, if you work with them in a respectful manner, can provide us with crucial new evidence that complements scientific understanding. Secondly, monitoring, or CBM, community-based monitoring, is a very urgent and fairly good method of detecting change in terms of arriving species, changes in habitats, salmon, and things like that. Lastly, I would argue that one of the most profound things we learned from the interaction with the First Nations and the indigenous peoples, even in this study, was the idea of the transformation of values and relations with the land. Very often, the indigenous peoples have a quite holistic view of what's happening, and they also convey the messages that this is also something that is the result of the centuries of wrong relations with the land. And that's why the morality, the values, and the kind of transformation that needs to be discussed in society has an essential component with First Nations and co-management regimes and the kind of indigenous governance that still exists, for example, with the Stalo on the lower mainland.
As you travel around the world, have you noticed any differences between different indigenous groups?
A lot of the work that we do takes place in Siberia, and I understand not all of your listeners might have the chance to visit northeastern Siberia at -60. So they'll be happy to know that there are still people that convey messages from a lifestyle that's fully nomadic, or at least as nomadic as possible, meaning that they are living in a very close relations and very traditional lifestyle, much like the Canadian Inuits and other northern peoples have been doing through centuries. Now, what's relevant here are two things. One, and they were actually part of this study, the Chukchi of northeastern Siberia. One, they can convey more precise information on how permafrost melt and other Arctic change happens, as they travel sometimes over 400 kilometers north to south with their reindeer, and they, as a part of their nomadic lifestyle, they observe the changes underway, which can give us in scale and in detail better idea of what's going on. Secondly, we should be listening very carefully and in a very specific way what these different societies are telling us. Because just like in Amazon or in central parts of Australia, Queensland, or in Siberia, you will still find very unique human societies, most of which will be indigenous peoples, and they have things to say that are quite profound in terms of, and I'll quote here one Siberian elder who said, "Nature doesn't trust us anymore." And while we may take all sorts of viewpoints on that statement, to me it tells a very disturbing call to reassess how we are doing as global society in our relations with the planet. If they are conveying that nature doesn't trust human societies anymore, that's really big news. And while you can dismiss that as oral history or anecdotal evidence, there are also other people who think that there are profound philosophical questions that are being conveyed with these messages. And that's why we should be listening instead of denying.
There's an awful lot of study from eco-psychologists and psychologists and Friends of the Earth who talk about our need to be in touch and get back to nature. So that's a very profound comment.
Yeah, I think all of us have to do something. And like I said before, we shouldn't be... Like, I'll use the example from my own village. Yes, I get to do this traveling and a lot of science and meet with the high-flying politicians or the scientists, but the things I do most and matter the most are the restoration actions here in the Selkie village. We are now bringing back our own river back to health, and it's only 8 kilometers long river, and it's suffering from a land use trouble. It's called Jukajoki, and using this example, I'm trying to convey that if the small doesn't matter, what matters? And that's why I hope that our paper is also a call to action for many, many small communities and individual peoples to say, look, why don't we restore our small creek? Why don't I join an association that works with the local First Nations to record and help what they are doing? I just had a chance to visit a week ago, and I'll just tell you this in one sentence, that there was a First Nations tribe called Lower Elwha tribe in Port Angeles on the Washington state, and they have worked with the US Geological Survey to remove hydro stations on their big river, and now the river is free again. And you can't find a better example of a transformative change than removal of those hydro stations on that Salmon River, just 50 kilometers from Vancouver. And that's why the profound change that can happen doesn't always have to be away or somewhere distant. It can be here, and if you are persistent enough and resilient enough, will survive.
Tero, I really want to thank you for spending time with us. Before we leave, two questions. One, how do we find out more about the Snow Change Cooperative?
Yes, thank you. You can go to our website, snowchange.org. It's online, and then if you want to get in touch with us, you can do that by sending an email to contact@snowchange.org. So that's the way to learn about what we do, and there are several films and publications, scientific articles, community stories in English on that website. So please, come to our website.
And with regards to the article in Science Magazine, the actual study itself, is that how to find it?
The actual study of people, if they really want to read the PDF, unfortunately, due to the way the Institution of American Association of Scientists works, you'll have to pay a little bit. So if you go to the Science Magazine's or Science Journal website, you'll find the article easily. Unfortunately, like I said, you have to pay a little bit to access the full article. Now, there are a number of open access media stories, like in The Guardian, in the Intercontinental Cry, CBC, and many other sources, and you'll get the best of the article by looking at these media sources, which are available to everybody.
Tero, I really want to thank you for spending time with us, especially giving up your evening in such a beautiful and distant place. Hopefully one time we'll be able to visit you there.
Well, I want to wish all of the people of British Columbia keep up the good work. You are leading the world in many, many ways for the better direction.
Thanks, Tero. You're very kind. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Our guest today has been Tero Mustonen. He's the director of the Arctic NGO, the Snow Change Cooperative, and he's the co-author of a new study published in Science Magazine called Biodiversity Redistribution Under Climate Change, Impacts on Ecosystems and Human Well-Being. A really fascinating discussion, especially considering he's just about to go to bed and in Finland, sitting at the very edge of the boreal forest. If you Google climate change and the many faces of denial, you'll find another 70 some odd conversations like this one on your favorite podcasting platform. That's another edition of the Conversation Lab. This radio program and podcast is produced by CFRO-FM in Vancouver's downtown east side. We're on the territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Our gratitude and thanks to them, as well as to the many not-for-profit organizations, community groups, and change makers around the world that support this program. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider becoming a member of Coopradio to support this program and the many others produced by hundreds of volunteers. If you have a story to share or know someone who does, please have them contact us at coopradio.org, theconversationlab.ca, and on many social media and podcasting platforms. This episode was cobbled together with some help from Brian McKinnon, Kimit Sekon, John Massacar, and Julian Anton. Thanks, guys, and thank you for listening. I'm Don Schaefer.